which is this whole idea of interim analysis and improved sequential trials. So there's a lot of in-depth, statistical aspects. I could get into this, but I'm going to try to keep it pretty high level in terms of, what the purpose here is and what are some of the high-level concerns that we have to think about. So at its basis, just to kind of set the framework, any clinical trial, and this is something that all the trainees have been grappling with and hopefully seeing success in your small groups, is that any clinical trial needs to answer at least one primary question. Right? What is the question you're trying to answer, right? In the affirmative or in the negative in your trial to move things forward. So the way that we would historically do research is you formulate your question, right? You come up with your design, you think of how you're going to analyze it, then you've got to figure out your assumptions, and then you do your required sample size to have a sufficient amount of power based on those assumptions. You would collect the data, and at the end of the study, you would do your analysis, and then you would have a result. Right? Maybe you're happy with it, maybe you're not, but you would have a result. Right? So there's a couple of aspects of that become important. Okay? One is, as carefully as we try to come up with reasonable assumptions for sample size calculations, they're educated guesswork at best. Right? Doing a clinical trial and I'm sure many of you have struggled with this in your protocols. When you're trying to figure out what assumptions you should use for your sample size calculation, it's kind of an interesting chicken and egg argument, in that if you knew all of the correct values for your assumptions, there would be no need to do the trial in the first place, right? And so you're trying to do the best you can with that, but we know that we're often wrong, like not wrong, but maybe a little bit wrong, maybe sometimes a lot wrong. Like a common example, and most of the time it's wrong in the case of your trial's probably more likely to be underpowered than overpowered. Simple things like you're basing it on estimates from your phase 2 study that was done in 2 or 3 sites. So you have variability from that. Then you go into a study with 30 sites, and your variance is higher, right? Because now you've got more site-to-site variability you're building in. Or like in a time-to-event study, you plan some accrual time period, and then surprise, surprise, your study accrues a little bit slower than you thought, right? That's going to affect your power. So with all of that, what we're trying to do with interim analysis is going back to this question of equipoise. That it's ethical to do a clinical trial if there is equipoise or uncertainty regarding whether your benefit works, right, is safe, and so forth. If it becomes clear before the planned end of the study, either because your assumptions are different or the data are just so strikingly positive or strikingly negative, that you have answered the question, then you can make an argument that it is unethical to continue to randomize participants to a treatment arm that you've proven is better or worse than the other. So just to give some examples of that to lay this is an idea, and I want to introduce the topic of curtailment just to set the stage, although this is rare in clinical trials. Curtailment would be you stop at interim analysis if your result is completely determined. Right? So I'm going to take an arbitrary study just to use an example for the discussion this morning. I'm going to assume I'm doing a clinical trial of some treatment versus control, 400 participants randomized 1-to-1 with 200 planned for each group, to see whether the treatment leads to more, quote, cures than the placebo. Right? So I'm planning for 400. Let's just say I happen to have the data set after I randomized 384 out of the 400 participants into the data set, and the table you see here is my 2x2 table of what I'm seeing. Right? Doesn't look very positive with respect to treatment, because I've got the same number of participants in both groups and the same number of successes. In fact, if I actually look, right, by proportion of success here, is 39% were successful in control, 39% were successful in treatment. Okay? So again, there's no difference I'm observing here, but the trial's not complete. Right? I still have additional participants to put in. So we can ask the question, right, how likely is it that the results could improve and reach statistical significance by the end of the study? Here, I've only got 16 participants left to put into the study. We assume, with 1-to-1, I'm going to assume 8 of those are going to go on treatment, 8 are going to go on control. And so if I look at my best case scenario in those remaining participants, if all 8 of the treatment participants are cured, and all 8 of the placebo participants are not cured, then it changes my estimates to 42% cured, on treatment, 38% on control, which looks a little bit better. But the p-value for that best case scenario would be 0.24, right? So, and that's my best case scenario. So what that means is, assuming there's 8 in each group in those remaining participants, it doesn't matter what mix of success and failures I get, there is absolutely no chance that the p-value would be below our threshold of 0.05, which would tell me that at this point in the study, I'm close to the end, but not at the end, if I haven't randomized those 16 participants yet, there's probably no need to. It's not going to change the answer. I have the answer to my question, right? So curtailment is kind of like, you could think of, and I'm actually, for the 1 week of the year, I'll use the term football to refer to what I will always otherwise call soccer, but just in honor of the World Cup. But it will be similar to something you'll be hearing, not now, but probably over the next week. So those of you who are familiar with World Cup setup, and those who aren't should be, because you're going to hear about it in the news, but the teams are in groups, and you play every team in your group, so each team plays 3 games, and then the top 2 teams from each group, and then the highest ranked top 3 teams go into the championship round, right? A tournament of 32 teams. After the first 2 games, some of the teams will have already clinched a spot in the championship round. What that clinch means is it really doesn't matter what happens in the 3rd game, they're going to be in the championship round. The 3rd game can help with their seeding, but they're already in. It's the same thing as you'll hear like at the end of a baseball season when a team has clinched the pennant, right? Clinching the pennant means if they lose every remaining game and every other team in their division wins all of their remaining games, there is no way they can catch them and pass them for first place, right? That's definitive. We don't typically have that in clinical trials. What we have in clinical trials is something that might be a little bit more iffy and with some uncertainty. So curtailment can only happen, right, when you're close enough that it's determined. Okay. You could have situations where the result was almost determined earlier. So here's a similar example to what I showed before, but in this time, I'm going to assume it's a little bit, still pretty late in the study, but it's a little bit earlier. So now I've got 360 out of my 400 when I'm looking at the data. So 180 in both groups. Again, I've got the same percentage of successes in both, 39%. I can ask the same question again. How likely is it that the results could improve and turn around and become statistically significant at the end of the study? Again, so in this case, I've got 20 in each group to put in. I could still look at that best case scenario. Under my best case scenario here, if all 20 on treatment were successes and all 20 on controls were failures, then I get a more impressive difference than I got before, right? 46 versus 36%, which would have a p-value of 0.03, right? So unlike the situation before, it is possible that I would get statistical significance, right? And in fact, we would have a p greater than 0.05 if the following happened. At least 3 of the 20 remaining treatment participants are not cured, or at least 3 of the 20 remaining control participants are cured, right? So there are combinations of things that could happen in the remaining 40 participants that could lead to statistical significance. But if you look at the possibility based on what we've seen so far, it seems like these bolded conditions are, in most cases, likely to happen. Right, so the chance that we get a combination that leads to a p-value less than 0.05 is not impossible, but it's pretty low. Okay, so in other words, and this reference will date me when I show this to my students, they stop getting it, and it really pisses me off. So hopefully you guys will. But from like a very famous movie, so you're telling me there's a chance, but the chance is not high. So what we're talking about often in interim monitoring is not that the result is determined, but that the result is probabilistically determined to some extent that we're comfortable with setting. Where we set that value may differ, whether we want to be more aggressive or more conservative in terms of what we say. And you can think of it in that way to compare. Interim monitoring is based on this principle of being fairly certain. It's really more like what happens on election night, right? So what I've shown here is a map from CNN that I pulled on election night in 2024 when Iowa was called for Donald Trump, okay, in the election. And you have, you see this map, but if you can't really see it here, but in the bottom, it has like 93, 94% of all votes were tabulated, right? And often, when you watch the news coverage, an election is called before all the votes are counted. All the votes aren't counted until days, weeks after the election. What's also of interest, and what is really relevant to the way we approach interim monitoring, is if you actually watch election coverage on different stations, or follow it on different news networks, they do not call a state at the same time. They have different levels of thresholds for what they use to call a state. That's comparable to then what we do when we do interim monitoring for clinical trials. Different studies, different researchers may have different criteria that they use to determine whether the trial should stop early, which is fairly comparable to this idea of the results determinism. A state, and one of the reasons they use different criteria, when you call an election or when you stop a trial, it doesn't mean that it's impossible that what you think will happen will not turn around, but it's unlikely. Right? And so if you remember in 2020, right, during the Biden-Trump election, Fox News called Arizona really early, and then there was some concerns that they call it too early because it was going to go in the other direction. So whatever you choose, it's not foolproof, but it means that at least the evidence is trending in the direction. Right? What all this means in the clinical trial complex is that a decision to stop a trial is complicated, right? And it needs a lot of different methods. So we have statistical methods that we typically perform in a group sequential manner in general groups. This, though, raises a concern related to what Kurt spoke about yesterday with multiple comparisons. If we look at the data multiple times, we can't stop the first time a p-value goes below 0.05 if we've looked multiple times, because we're going to inflate our type 1 error. And this is just the general table similar to what Kurt showed. So the solution here is that we have to adjust our stopping boundaries. So that if we say we're doing a clinical trial and we're going to do 3 interim looks and a look at the end, we could not at each of those interim looks compute our p-value and reject the null if the p is less than 0.05. We have to decide how we're going to allocate that alpha across the looks if we want to preserve the overall type 1 error rate at 5%. Right? So many of you have noticed there's this HOSA, this Healthcare Occupation Students of America here. There are all these high school kids running around there, right? So alpha spending in a clinical trial is similar to when you go on a high school trip, right? When I went on a high school trip, my parents would give me money to spend. All these kids probably have money that their parents gave them to spend. There are different types of the way kids take advantage of that money on the trips. There are the people who blow it all the first day, right? And then they have no money left for the trip. There's the hoarders who don't spend anything and save it all for the end, and then there's some who maybe spend it consistently throughout the week that they're here. The same principle applies to clinical trials. You have so much alpha to spend. If you want to, you can blow it all on your first interim analysis, but then you're not going to have anything left to the end. You can spend it consistently across interim analysis, which is a stopping approach called POCOC, which is basically the interim monitoring version of non-conforming correction. You spend the same amount of alpha at each stopping goal. And then the more common one is what is called O'Brien-Fleming, which is one where you spend very conservatively early in the trial and try to save most of your alpha at the end. Now, it's probably the most popular. It's the most popular with statisticians because it prevents us from having really complicated conversations with clinicians. Right? The problem with POCOC, where you're spending equal, is that you don't have all your alpha at the end. So if you're just looking at whatever p-value your statistical output spits out, if you've done POCOC or other types of alpha spending and you get at the end of the study a p-value of 0.042, your researcher's all excited, woohoo, p-value less than 0.05. But you cannot claim statistical significance in many cases because you've spent so much alpha that you only have a limited amount to spend at the end. Now, I've been in one situation in my career where that actually happened, and I can tell you, having those conversations and writing that paper with the researcher is a real pain in the rear end because the whole world is conditioned to think that 0.05 is this magical, beautiful number, which being below as significant. So, but O'Brien-Fleming is a case where we spend very little. It also is one of the desired approaches because it's kind of consistent with, I think, what we typically want with clinical trials. We really only want to stop early if we're really sure or in other words, that probability is lower, and the earlier we want to be even more confident that it is. So typically with O'Brien, Fleming, you wouldn't stop unless the p-value, or like the z, if you think of the z statistic, it typically, at your first interim analysis, would have to be in the scale of 3 or higher, which is way out in the extremes of the normal distribution for what you would be. So that's for interim monitoring for efficacy. There is also, let me just skip ahead, whoops. There's also, when we talk about futility monitoring, yes,
Chris, so why, as a clinician researcher, would I ever want you to spend your alpha early? I've got the money, I get the patients, we're recruiting well.
Yeah.
Why do I want my statistician to ruin my chance?
You're talking like an academic researcher, right? Well, I think that's one of the problems, and I mean, not a problem, but a challenge. So there is, I think there is, and the Berry team may want to weigh in on this too, but I think the tendency, or at least the trends, I think industry trials are way more likely to stop early, particularly for futility, than academic trials are, for the very reason you mentioned, right? So even at my level as a statistician, I run a data coordinating center. I've got maybe 5 to 10 people being paid off of this grant. If the trial stops early for futility, they're no longer paid off of that grant. I have to find other funding for them to go to. So there are disincentives. There are disincentives in industry too, but also industry doesn't want to throw money down the drain if it's futile. Yeah, Kurt.
Assuming I understood the question, sorry, I had to step out.
If you didn't, it would be even better.
So my usual impression, big pharma will stop early a lot, especially for futility is by far the more important thing to stop early for. Success, I would highly recommend you plan for it, but it just doesn't happen often. The thing so big pharma, small biotechs are exactly the opposite. They don't want to stop for futility because when they stop for futility, every one of them's fired. So anyway, it depends on what you mean by pharma.
Yeah. So. But it's the same thing for academic researchers. You have that, I mean, from us and for other, for everybody here that will go on, you're managing funding to support your grant portfolio, and it's like a delicate balance of trying to find a new grant when an old grant ends, and you're trying to plan in advance, and then all of a sudden something changes 2 or 3 years earlier than you thought. It really changes your plans. Do you have thoughts on your question?
Well, it's just, how do you make the decision O'Brien Fleming versus the P-Hawk or whatever?
You should look at my LinkedIn. I have a whole thing on that this week.
This gets to the importance of having lots of design discussions early in the study and having your statistician and kind of going through different principles.
And looking at Kurt's LinkedIn.
Yeah, looking at Kurt's LinkedIn. The last thing I'll say, because I know we're out of time, is there are also ways to look at futility with conditional power or predictive power. And you could you could use either of these approaches for efficacy and futility, but the standard is you typically use alpha spending functions for efficacy and these conditional or predictive power for futility. So I do have generally some conclusions here, but in general I would say it's important to recognize that. I will go back to a point that we made in one of the statistics discussions. What is really awkward as the statistician is when you are trending towards futility, or there was a DSMB discussion where futility was strongly considered, but decided not to act on. But maybe there's another DSMB meeting in 6 months where it may be very likely, if it trends there, that you would act on it. So I'm going to pick on Valerie for a minute. I would say Valerie's presenting to a DSMB. Her study was really close to that futility margin. The DSMB strongly considered doing that. But they decided, okay, the evidence is not quite strong enough. We haven't crossed the pre-specified bound. We're going to let it continue, but we are very worried about this for the next visit. Meanwhile, the study is struggling with recruitment, and they're considering adding 10 more sites. And they're spending money to bring those sites on board. What Valerie cannot do is tell them, hey, you're throwing money down the drain because by the time we bring those sites on, the study may not exist. That gets to the point of the poker face aspect that they mentioned before. But then also what Valerie gets is at the end of the day, when they're shut down at that next meeting, is, well, why didn't you tell me that we were going to do this? You let us blow through all this money. That's part of, though, if you're aware of that, and that's why often is presenting unblind, you want to try to remove yourself from those discussions as much as possible so you're not put into them. Thank you, Chris. And if anybody during the break, you have time to check out if you